Louise Gallagher got a flutter in her stomach that she couldn't ignore when she met Conrad Cheney.
He was really mysterious and romantic. Everything about him was exciting.
But mystery turned to misery when Conrad's dark past became Louise's even darker present.
Everything she knew was a lie. It was an absolute living hell for her.
The amount of control that he had over her was astounding.
Fueled by terror, Louise was forced to make the ultimate sacrifice to save the ones she loved.
She was trapped. There was literally no escaping.
I was in a panic. I couldn't believe I'd entrusted my life to such a monster.
When it comes to love and marriage, things aren't always as they seem. Investment executive Louise Gallagher had no intentions of mixing work and play in August of 1998. The 44-year-old single mother from Calgary, Canada, knew what her priorities were.
I had two amazing young daughters, Alexis and Lisanne, who were 12 and 10 years old, and I really needed to focus on them.
But her attention shifted that fall when a new client pulled up on the scene.
It was the company that manufactured kit cars. And I had gone to talk to this company that was looking to go public.
And when Louise met the company's senior partner, 45-year-old Conrad Cheney, she was instantly charmed.
When I first met Conrad, I shook his hand and, I had that sense that I'd met him before. And I said,
"We met before? You look really familiar."
He looked deeply into my eyes and said, "Oh no, if we'd ever met before, I'd never have let you go." And I thought, ooh, wow, that's quite the line.
When Louise told me about meeting this wonderful man, she described it to me as almost a magnetic force. She was mesmerized by him.
So when Conrad asked Louise out on an official date, she decided it couldn't hurt to mix a little pleasure with business.
We went to one of my favorite restaurants, and Conrad was really charming. He spent a lot of time telling me how beautiful I am. The flattery was a little overwhelming, but I couldn't deny my attraction to him.
But as Louise blushed, Conrad suddenly turned pale.
Midway through the dinner, suddenly Conrad got really shaky and started to have, belabored breathing. I had no idea what was going on. He got up from the table and made a phone call, and then two guys from his plant came and they left. I was feeling really unnerved. To disappear like that, it's very strange.
Several days passed before Louise finally heard from Conrad, and his explanation created more questions than answers.
Conrad called and told me that he had been quite ill. I asked him what it was, but he wouldn't talk about it. It was clearly distressing him. I was definitely worried about him.
Over the next few weeks, however, Louise's concerns were overshadowed by Conrad's charm.
Conrad was the ultimate romantic. He sent this huge bouquet of flowers one day with a note that just said, "From one of your greatest admirers." So I was falling hard for him.
I thought he was really charismatic. I could tell my mom was genuinely falling for this man. And so to see her find someone was really exciting for us.
After 3 months of dating, Conrad treated Louise to a spontaneous weekend getaway. And the surprises didn't stop there.
We got there and were at dinner, and he pulled a ring out of his pocket. I mean, it was stunningly beautiful. I was shocked. And I said, "This is way too soon. We need to just take this slowly. There's all the time in the world."
That's when Conrad made a dire confession.
He said, "I have a heart condition. If I don't take care of it,
Could be dead by Christmas."
just a couple of months away." I was stunned. I couldn't believe that here's my Prince Charming and he's gonna die.
Conrad told Louise the only thing that could save him was an experimental surgery in California. So that night, Louise accepted Conrad's marriage proposal.
I didn't know if he would survive this surgery. But how could I say no to a man who loves me so deeply and needs me? I felt that I had to do this for him.
But Conrad's heart wasn't the only thing in trouble. And before long, Louise would find herself drawn into a dark underworld that she couldn't escape.
Louise had no idea what or who was out there, and she was terrified.
We were blindsided when things began to unravel.
I was in too deep, and it wasn't going to stop until they had what they wanted.
In the winter of 1998, Louise Gallagher was devastated to learn from her fiancé, Conrad Cheney, that he had a rare heart disease and his time was running out.
Conrad told me that he had 3 months to live. Needless to say, I wanted to spend every moment with him that I could.
But according to Conrad, with a risky surgery scheduled in the coming weeks, he was too busy to spend much time with Louise. Still, Conrad was there for Louise when it mattered most. When she needed knee surgery that November, it was Conrad who came to her rescue.
When I was released from the ER, Conrad was right there to pick me up. But as I got in the car, I saw him pick something heavy off the front seat and move it into the back seat. I thought it was a gun. When I mentioned it to him, he reassured me that it was just a toy. And it was something left over from his daughter's Halloween event or something. I laughed at myself because that was just really weird of me to even think that.
After spending New Year's Day together, Louise said a sad goodbye to Conrad as he left for his surgery.
I'd asked if I could go to California to be there, but he said that that wouldn't be a good thing because he needed to conserve his energy. So I remember feeling so lost because I knew he may or may not survive.
Finally, 4 days later, Louise received a call, but it wasn't from Conrad.
It was his associates calling me to say that they believed it was a success. They said he wasn't able to talk. They were trying to keep him really quiet and calm.
She was relieved that he'd made it through the surgery, but still very frustrated to be here in Calgary. She really wanted to be there with him.
So Louise was overjoyed when her fiancé returned the following month and said he was fully recovered.
I was just ecstatic to be with him. But I must admit, he looked really healthy for a guy who'd had this crazy, risky surgery. But I just decided to let it go.
But what Louise couldn't let go was the feeling she was inching closer to the bottom of Conrad's priority list.
Conrad was always too tired from recovering or too busy catching up at work. And I began to feel more pushed to the side.
Louise's feelings of doubt were replaced with dread when Conrad gave her some crushing news.
I was sound asleep and the phone rang. It was about 1:30 in the morning. And I answered the phone, and all I could hear was Conrad crying.
Sorry, Louise. I'm sorry. Are you all right?
And what Conrad said next would force Louise into a prison of fear and paranoia that would change her life forever.
It was like a living hell for her.
When he said those words, it was like someone kicked the air right out of me.
In February of 1999, Louise Gallagher received a frantic phone call from her fiancé, Conrad Cheney, that turned her entire world upside down.
All he would say was, "I'm so sorry, I've put you in harm's way."
Sorry, Louise. I'm sorry.
And he told me that he was part of an organized crime family and that they had discovered his love for me. I was stunned. I couldn't believe that it was true.
According to Conrad, his mafia family was angry that he was in love with someone outside their trusted circle. After all, with pillow talk comes loose lips.
I didn't have any secrets to share, but Conrad would say they don't believe that. And he said he had received an envelope, and in the envelope, There were 3 bullets, and one for me and one for each of my daughters. It was a warning that we were in danger. I just remember this feeling of being absolutely terrified.
Louise thought a call to the police was their only hope, but Conrad had other plans.
He said, if you go to the police, they will know. And that's what would trigger them to kidnapping the girls.
Terrified and unable to sleep that night, Louise thought back to her relationship with Conrad. And suddenly, all the pieces came together.
The gun made sense. I just thought to myself, oh my God, it must not have been a toy gun at all. So I was angry with myself because I put my daughters in this situation. And it was all my fault. And I didn't know what to do.
To keep her daughters safe, Louise kept the mafia threat to herself, but slowly the secret ate away at her.
This was not something I felt that they needed to carry, so I had to pretend like everything was just fine.
But soon after, the threats against Louise seemed to become a reality.
One day, one of my neighbors came over and she said, I saw somebody sneaking around your car. And I phoned Conrad, and he immediately sent his associates over to look for bombs under the car. They never found anything, but it was just this constant, unsettling fear.
Louise's only peace of mind was that Conrad had her followed everywhere for her protection.
I thought it was scary and unsettling, but he had had me followed, and he always knew where I was. But he was protecting me and my daughters.
Later that summer, the stress of the situation caused Conrad's health to take another grim turn.
I got a phone call from one of his associates saying that Conrad was in California in hospital and that they were going to put him on life support system. Part of my mind went to this place that said, Conrad is protecting me and my daughters, and as long as Conrad is alive, then my daughters are safe. But if he died, I just didn't know what was going to happen. I was terrified.
Within days of learning of Conrad's condition, Louise ran into a friend at a local coffee shop. Alone and afraid, she broke down and told him about her fiancé in a coma in California.
My friend agreed he wouldn't tell anyone, but a few days later, I received a phone call from a woman who was a friend of my friend, and she just said, my daughter Rebecca is talking to a man on life support in California as well, and his name's Conrad. And I thought, no, that can't be.
Flooded with emotions, Louise arranged to meet the woman that very day at her home and discovered Rebecca's Conrad and her Conrad were one and the same.
She just broke down, and I just got really angry. It was like someone stabbed me in the heart, and I was in shock.
Enraged, the two women immediately drove to Conrad's office to demand information on his condition and whereabouts. And what they found was appalling.
We walked straight into Conrad's office, and sure enough, there he was, sitting behind his desk. He should be on life support, but he's not. He's sitting there. Rebecca just started yelling at him. But I was just absolutely speechless.
Louise may have been at a loss for words, but Conrad wasn't.
He said that he had lied about being on life support to protect us. He hoped it would somehow shake the mafia off of his trail. He had started seeing Rebecca in the hopes that it would take the mafia's attention off of me. That it didn't change the fact that he was cheating, and I was devastated. Conrad said that he was going to end everything with Rebecca and reminded me of what could happen if I broke up with him.
If Louise walked away and then something happened to one of her daughters, she'd never forgive herself. She couldn't take that chance.
Conrad told Louise he ended it with Rebecca, and for the next 3 years, Louise stayed under Conrad's thumb, always fearful of when his mafia family would make their move.
My sister and I realized that Conrad was toxic.
You have to break up with him.
It was really clear that she had no intention of leaving him. So we went to live with my dad.
That was the moment my heart just broke. They didn't know I was only staying with Conrad for their own protection. That was best for them that they stay with their dad, because with me, they would be in danger.
By January 2003, the strain and threats were becoming too much. So Conrad came up with a solution. The couple would steal away in the middle of the night to the Canadian countryside, where no one, not even the mafia, could find them.
All I could think of was that I had to get him away from the people I loved. So I just went with him.
But soon Louise would discover that the mafia was the least of her worries. There was something much closer and much more dangerous to fear.
She had no idea what Conrad had in store for her. She never saw it coming.
My biggest fear was that I'd never be able to tell her that I still loved her.
I remember thinking, he's gonna kill me. Today's the day.
In the spring of 2003, Louise Gallagher was convinced that she and her fiancé, Conrad Cheney, would be safe from the mafia by hiding out in the Canadian wilderness.
For 3 months, we stayed in a bed and breakfast out in the country. But Conrad was acting so different. He would scream and he would remind me of how all of it was my fault. I was just terrified. I just thought he was going to kill me because he had to get rid of me. And I kept waiting for him to do it.
After almost 4 months of hiding, they had some unexpected visitors.
I was in a panic. I thought the police were going to tell me that something had happened to my daughters and that all of it had been for nothing.
Louise was shocked and relieved to learn that it wasn't her daughters that were in trouble. It was Conrad.
They had a warrant and they started to read off the list of charges and they told him he was under arrest. And I thought, who is this man?
Conrad wasn't wanted by the mafia. He was wanted by the law for charges of breaking and entering, fraud, and forgery. And thanks to Louise's loved ones, police were able to track him down.
When Louise vanished, we had a sense of the peril she was in. So we went to the police and we told them that we knew she was with Conrad.
The police had warrants out for Conrad's arrest, so they knew that if they found Louise, then they would find Conrad. So they managed to track Louise down through a check that she had written.
And when they did, Louise was dumbfounded to find that nothing about her fiancé was as it seemed.
Conrad presented this image of a very, very successful business when in fact it was crumbling. It was close to bankruptcy. And that's what led him to open cell phone accounts in his daughter's name. He had purchased a car in his aunt's name, and they filed charges against Conrad.
This lightning bolt hit me, and it wasn't until then that I realized just how deeply rooted Conrad's lies were.
It turned out Conrad wasn't just broke and a fraud. He was a cheat and a stalker as well.
Conrad told Louise he was going to break up with Rebecca, but he kept seeing her. She tried to break up with him. He didn't like that, so he began stalking Rebecca, harassing her. He broke into her home, and she had him charged for that.
Police took Conrad into custody, and Louise's family brought her back to safety and to her daughters.
My sisters and my mom had flown them out to Vancouver to see me. And it was so magical. Alexis and Lisanne are the reason I'm alive today.
I don't think I could put into words how much I love my mom and how thankful I am that she made it through.
With Conrad behind bars, Louise learned the truth from police and finally realized she was just a pawn in his sick game.
The only heart condition Conrad ever had was that he didn't have a heart. He was not part of an organized crime family. They were not these evil men waiting out there and willing to kidnap the girls. Everything he told me was a lie. I felt used and I felt empty and I felt devastated.
In July of 2003, Conrad Cheney pled guilty to fraud, forgery, and breaking and entering. He was sentenced to 2 years, 1 month, and 26 days in federal prison.
This wasn't about a love affair gone bad. It was about abuse. They didn't believe evil existed, but I believe evil does exist now.
Today, Louise has healed from her experience, and she's stronger than ever.
I have gained back my self-respect, and I've gained my daughters back. And we have a relationship that is stronger and is filled with love and caring.
The light is definitely back in my mom's eyes. And I don't think that there will ever be anything that could extinguish that again.
I can't stop an abuser being who they are, but I can't stop their abuse in my life. Nothing can destroy me as long as I stand true to me.
After 10 years of marriage, single mom Christy Smith was looking for someone with an edge.
Randy was wild and exciting, and he treated me like a total princess.
He made my mom laugh, and they meshed well together.
But Christy had no idea her new love's deception would cut like a knife.
I didn't think anybody could ever be that evil.
And the man who brought her so much pleasure would bring her unimaginable pain.
It was absolutely sadistic what he did.
I just kept screaming. The pain was unreal.
When it comes to love and marriage, things aren't always as they seem. In the fall of 1999, 30-year-old Texan Christy Smith couldn't deny that after 10 years of marriage, the magic was missing.
There was no excitement. There was no passion. So all of a sudden, I found myself separated with a 13-year-old and an 8-year-old. But I was very excited to start dating, to get back out there.
So it seemed fortuitous when that October, she and her best friend Crystal ran into an old high school friend, Randy Cooper, at a local bar in Fort Worth.
I had a very big crush on Randy when we were in high school, and I just thought he was gorgeous.
So when Randy mentioned that he was recently divorced, he had Christy's full attention.
Randy was working odd jobs, just anything to make money. But he was just as gorgeous as I remember.
As the three friends reconnected, however, it seemed Randy had his eyes set on Crystal.
Randy was attractive, and he was so funny. So I decided to go ahead and give him a chance to go ahead and go out with him.
I would have wished it was me, but it was fun being around him. After the night we met, we became very good friends.
But the following week, after one date with Randy, Crystal decided he wasn't the man for her.
I met him at a restaurant, and within 5 minutes of him telling me that he was in prison,
I don't know, don't worry about it.
I thought, this man is weird and crazy. I told Christy that I knew that this was not a man I would ever date.
She just thought he was too wild. And Randy would tell me stories that just seemed unreal. I wasn't really surprised because I really knew Crystal and that he wouldn't be her type. But it didn't bother me at all. It actually intrigued me. Bye.
So when Christy dropped by Randy's house a few weeks later, she was excited when he hinted that he wanted more than a friendship.
Crystal just doesn't get my humor.
He said, but you do. He said, and we have so much fun together. He was interested in actually dating me. I was just on cloud nine.
Over the next month, Christy began seeing Randy regularly, despite her friends' disapproval.
The more I tried to get Christy to stay away from Randy, the closer they got. So I did not hang out with Christy while they were together.
Randy always said Crystal's just jealous. It bothered me when Crystal would talk about Randy because I was crazy in love. We had so much fun together.
But the icing on the cake was seeing how great Randy was with her kids.
Randy was fun to be around. He would spend time with us, not just my mom. He would tell us jokes and would always cut up with us.
He even kept Christy entertained with his over-the-top storytelling.
One morning, Randy said, "Have you ever heard of possum and snake?" And I said, "No." So he told me that a possum comes up and there's a snake by the river.
And the snake's cold.
Tells the possum, "Will you please let me in your pouch to get warm? If you'll help me, I won't bite you." So the possum lets him in his pouch, gets him across the river.
And as soon as he does, the snake crawls up to strike. And the possum says, "Wait a minute, I thought you were gonna hurt me." The snake says, "I'm a snake, stupid. What did you think?"
Then the snake struck the possum and killed it. I had no idea why Randy told me that story. I just didn't get it. But Randy kept me on my toes. And I loved it, every bit of it.
So after 2 months of dating, when Randy asked her if he could move in, Christy was ecstatic.
We always wanted to be together, and the children seemed to really like him. And so he moved in. I was a really lucky girl.
But Christy had no idea her luck was about to run out when Randy's wild imagination would become her terrifying reality.
His behavior had changed so drastically.
He had a plan and nothing was going to stop him.
I saw the joy he took in causing pain. He was just evil.
In February of 2000, Christy Smith had been separated from her husband for 1 year when her new boyfriend, Randy Cooper, moved in with her and her 2 kids.
My ex-husband did want me back, and he was very upset about Randy living in the house. But I was so happy to have everyone I loved under one roof. When I was with Randy, I felt like nothing in the world could harm me. Nothing.
But a week later, Christy became troubled when Randy made an odd discovery.
So I go out in the garage, and he's got a handful of, like, empty chip wrappers, empty candy bar wrappers.
What is this?
He said he had found them all in the attic.
There's piles of this stuff.
He said, "It almost looks like somebody could be staying in the attic." I thought, oh no, that's crazy. There's no way. So I just kind of, blew it off.
Then the following week, Randy came home with more disturbing news.
Randy said that my ex-husband had followed him home.
He was wearing a disguise in the car.
And he was wearing some type of disguise. I was shocked. I was like, there's no way. My ex had not a mean bone in his body. But Randy insisted it was my ex-husband. So I asked my ex, "You're not parking at the end of the street, are you?" And he said, "No, why would I do that?" So I thought Randy was just blowing this all out of proportion because he had a very wild imagination.
Christy was starting to seriously worry about her boyfriend.
He started getting a lot more irritated about things, like if the children left the lights on, he would take the light bulb out.
I thought it was really weird for doing something innocent like leaving the lights on. It seemed like his mood would change at the drop of a dime.
He just wasn't the happy-go-lucky Randy that I was used to. I was worried that I had just fallen for the fairy tale and that it just wasn't going to work.
But on Valentine's Day, her concerns soon subsided when Randy's doting nature returned.
My ex-husband had taken the kids for the whole week, so Randy would just do romantic things. I got my old Randy back again.
And on February 23rd, nothing would top Randy's display of affection.
We had went to the bar, and we had got there. He looked at me and said,
Today's gonna be a special day.
he gave me a kiss, and he walked up onto the stage, and he said,
Hey, I'm gonna need everybody's attention.
I have found the love of my life.
Christy, come on up here.
And he said, Christy, will you marry me? I was just so excited. It was so unexpected. And I said yes, of course. And he just seemed like he was on cloud nine.
The lovebirds ordered a round of drinks for all, and the celebration began. But the excitement quickly caught up to Christy.
And I told Randy, I said, my head was spinning, and I started having problems with my stomach. And he said, well, let's get you home, babe.
When they arrived, Randy gently led her to the bedroom.
I said, well, go on in and put on something cute and lay down. And he would bring me some aspirin. So I went in and put on a negligee. I was trying to stay awake. I guess I kind of dozed off a little bit.
Moments later, Christy awoke to an unrecognizable voice.
Wake up, bitch! I thought you were my angel, but you're just a lying whore!
After her boyfriend proposed on February 23, 2000, Christy Smith dozed off peacefully, but woke up in a nightmare.
Wake up, bitch! I'm gonna torture you! You're gonna wish you were dead!
And he said, you're gonna know pain like you've never felt pain.
I thought you were my angel!
Then he reached over and he punched me in the face. And I was just shocked.
Before Christy could even react, Randy grabbed a bat.
He hit me in the head with a bat. And I kept putting my hands over my head. And he said, better put them hands down. And I started screaming, and I kept asking him why. Randy said, I kissed a male friend of mine at a time before me and him had started dating. And he told me that he was going to torture me until he knew the truth.
Did you kiss him?
What he was asking didn't make sense. Why would he care if I kissed this man before we dated? And I said, I love you, Randy. I would never cheat on you. And he said that that was a lie. And then he doubled up his fist and he hit me.
You're lying to me!
The pain was unreal. And my face was bleeding. And I kept telling him I didn't do it. But I'll tell you I did. If you'll just stop. Just stop. And he just laughed and swung again. Then he choked me till I was consciousness. And I woke up and he was slapping me in the face. And he said, you're not getting away that easy. I thought Randy was going to kill me.
Randy was unrelenting as he continued to torture Christy over the next several hours.
There were tools on the dresser. And he picked up this belt buckle. And he hit me from head to toe. He picked up the wire cutters and the pliers. And he started to cut my nipples off. It was just the most unbelievable pain.
Then Randy suddenly paused to show Christy his handiwork. Just as hope seemed lost, Christy's thoughts turned to her children.
I loved my kids too much, but I was not gonna let him win. I was not. I had to be there for my babies. In that moment, I knew that if I didn't make it to that phone, that there was no hope. And the thought came to me, I told Randy, let's just try to call my friend, that guy that you were accusing me of kissing, and he'll tell you the truth. He'll tell you if I kissed him or not.
All right.
And he said, if you can't make it into the kitchen, you're not gonna have any idea what pain is.
Christy crawled to the kitchen to get to the phone.
And as soon as I got a dial tone, I called 911.
911, what's your emergency? Hello, are you there? Hello?
On February 24th, 2000, after suffering hours of unimaginable torture at the hands of her fiancé, Randy Cooper, Christy Smith could only hope her attempt to call 911 had worked.
I didn't know if I got through or not, but Randy was screaming he was gonna kill me before anybody could get there.
Seconds later, 911 made a routine follow-up call.
Hello? Hello? No, actually my son did. Yeah, well, actually, I picked up the telephone.
Then I just screamed like nobody's ever screamed. And he hung up the phone, he started screaming at me. I told him, just take my car, just go. I don't care, just go.
As Randy searched for her keys, Christy made it to the bathroom.
I got the window open and I got the door locked. And that's all I had left. The pain was just so overwhelming.
Two patrol officers were dispatched. When the officers pulled up, Randy was walking out the front door. They noticed that he had blood on his clothing and blood on his hands, and he kept trying to tell the officers that children had made the 911 call.
They might have been playing with the phone, you know.
But they heard faint screams coming from within the house. Officers detained Randy outside, and the other officers made their way into the house.
Police discovered Christy barely conscious.
Randy's trying to kill me.
She was bloody and bruised, and she was telling them that Randy was trying to kill her. She had significant injuries. Something horrible had gone on in the home. I haven't seen any assault like that ever. Randy told the officers that Christy had come home in that condition, but it was obvious to officers that a disturbance had gone on there. They found blood in the bedroom, ball bats, a hammer, pliers, apparently items that Randy had used on Christy at the time. From that point forward, Randy would no longer speak to the police and ask for an attorney.
Randy Cooper was immediately arrested while Christy was rushed to the nearest hospital.
Christy had skull fractures, a broken jaw, broken teeth. She had a broken arm and significant bruising and cuts all up and down her body. I was amazed that she was still alive.
I knew that Randy was crazy, but I didn't think anybody could ever be that evil or how anybody could do that to another person.
It was really horrifying to find out what happened. I talked to my mom on the phone while she was in the hospital. She told us that everything was okay and that she'd be home.
While awaiting Randy's trial over the next 2 years, Christy healed physically, but emotionally she was still suffering.
I remember just still being in shock. It didn't make any sense how he could hurt me that bad. Because I loved him completely and with all my heart.
On July 9th, 2002, Randy Cooper pled not guilty to the charge of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon.
At the trial, I learned that Randy's ex-wife had been beaten repeatedly. He had been very threatening to women for years and years.
I would describe Randy's actions as sociopathic, especially given light that he tried to lie to officers. I believe if Randy had actually killed Christy, that later down the road, other people would be in his crosshairs as well.
Christy couldn't help but wonder if Randy had been planning the attack all along.
There was no real reason behind what he did, because he thought I kissed a male friend of mine. It was like he was grasping at a reason to hurt me. I believe Randy was trying to set up my ex-husband from the very beginning. I think he saw that there was a possible way to kill someone and get away with it. I think that the whole time he had been planning to torture me.
And now she understood why Randy might have chosen her instead of her best friend.
I think he saw me as an easy mark because I was trusting. All I kept thinking is how I could have been so gullible, how I could have been so wrong.
On July 11th, 2002, Randy Cooper was found guilty and sentenced to 99 years in prison.
I loved him so much, and I would have done anything except die for him. Randy won the battle, but I won the war because I lived.
Today, after countless surgeries, Christy still suffers a great deal from her injuries.
I have my good days and my bad days. I have to deal with unbelievable pain. And it is a limited life that I have, but at least I have one.
It's going to be a struggle for her the rest of her life. But the motivating drive for Christy during this whole ordeal has been her children. That keeps her motivated.
In hindsight, Christy finally understands what Randy meant by the possum and the snake story.
That was one of the main red flags. He was trying to give me a hint of what a snake he was. But in my possum the snake story, the possum is a survivor.
The desert keeps secrets better than almost anywhere on Earth. In the summer of 2000, under a sky that looked endless and indifferent, a quiet neighborhood outside Phoenix, Arizona would become the center of a mystery that would haunt investigators for decades. A single house, a single disappearance, and a silence so complete that for years it felt as if the desert itself had swallowed the truth. On the evening of June 14th, 2000, the sun sank slowly over the dusty streets of Glendale, casting long orange shadows across rows of modest suburban homes. It was the kind of place where nothing dramatic was supposed to happen. Lawns trimmed, mailboxes aligned. Neighbors waved politely, but rarely lingered long enough to talk. But at 9:37 p.m., a phone call shattered that routine calm. A man named David Mercer dialed 911, his voice tight, controlled, almost rehearsed. He said his wife was missing. Dispatchers asked the usual questions. When was the last time he saw her? Had they argued? Did she leave a note? Mercer answered calmly. Too calmly, some would later say. He told them that his wife, 32-year-old Emily Mercer, had gone for an evening walk just after sunset. Something she often did to clear her mind after work. According to David, she never came back. At first glance, it sounded like a typical missing person case. Adults disappear sometimes. They walk away from their lives, from marriages, from quiet suburban routines. But something about the call stuck with the dispatcher. Not panic, not fear. Precision. David Mercer spoke in neat, careful sentences. He described the time she left, the clothes she wore, the direction she walked, almost like he had memorized it. Within 30 minutes, patrol cars rolled into the neighborhood. Red and blue lights flashed silently across garage doors and parked cars. Officers knocked on doors. Porch lights flicked on. Curtains moved. Emily Mercer had been well known on the block. A friendly face. A receptionist at a medical office downtown. Someone who smiled easily, someone who watered her plants every morning before work. No one had seen her leave. No one had seen her walking. And strangely, no one remembered hearing a door close. Police entered the Mercer home just after 10:15 p.m. Inside, everything looked normal. Too normal. The living room was tidy. A lamp glowed softly beside a couch. A half-finished mug of tea sat on the coffee table. Emily's purse was still there. Her phone, too. Investigators exchanged quiet glances. People rarely go for evening walks without their phone. Even in 2000, Detective Alan Rios arrived shortly before midnight. A veteran investigator who had seen enough crime scenes to recognize when a story didn't quite line up. He walked slowly through the house, his eyes scanning every corner.
Kitchen. Hallway.
Bedroom. Nothing looked disturbed, but one thing stood out. The back door. It was unlocked. Rios crouched near the door frame, shining a flashlight across the floor. The tile was clean, recently mopped perhaps. But just outside, in the thin layer of desert dust that coated the patio, there were footprints. 2 sets. One smaller, possibly Emily's. The other larger. He stood up slowly. David Mercer had told officers Emily left through the front door, but the tracks were at the back. When questioned again, David paused for the first time that night. Just a moment. A flicker of uncertainty. Then he adjusted his story. Maybe she changed her mind and went out back first, he suggested. Maybe she walked around the house. It sounded plausible.
Technically.
But something about the shift stuck in Rios's mind like a splinter. By morning, search teams combed the surrounding desert. Volunteers, police officers, helicopters circling above dusty washes and rocky trails. The Arizona sun climbed higher, baking the landscape. But there was no sign of Emily Mercer. No body. No struggle. No abandoned clothing. Just a missing woman and a quiet husband who insisted he had no idea what happened. For days, investigators knocked on doors throughout the neighborhood. Most residents repeated the same thing. They hadn't seen Emily that night. But one neighbor remembered something unusual. Across the street lived an elderly man named Harold Benton, a retired mechanic who spent most evenings sitting on his porch watching the neighborhood settle into darkness. He told detectives he had seen David Mercer outside around 8:45 p.m. Not walking. Not searching. Standing beside his garage. And according to Benton, David wasn't alone. There was someone else near the driveway. A shadowy figure. But Benton couldn't say who. The detail changed the tone of the investigation instantly. Detectives returned to the Mercer house with a warrant. This time, they searched more carefully. They opened cabinets, checked drains, pulled apart the garage. And that's where they noticed something else. The concrete floor near the back wall had a faint discoloration, almost like something had been scrubbed aggressively. Crime scene technicians sprayed luminol across the surface. Within seconds, pale blue patterns lit up under the darkened lights.
Blood.
A lot of it. Too much for a simple accident. David Mercer was brought in for questioning again that afternoon. This time, the calm tone was gone. Detectives asked him about the blood in the garage. He leaned back in the interrogation chair, rubbing his face slowly. Then he offered an explanation. Emily had cut her hand days earlier while opening a box, he said. Maybe she bled there. The explanation felt weak. But without a body, prosecutors hesitated. Investigators kept digging. They searched the backyard with ground-penetrating radar. They examined the Mercer vehicles. They combed nearby desert trails again and again. Still nothing. Weeks turned into months. The case began to cool. Emily Mercer was officially listed as a missing person. And David Mercer continued living in the same quiet house where his wife had vanished. Neighbors whispered. Speculation spread. But there was never enough evidence to charge him. Detective Rios refused to let it go. Something about David Mercer bothered him deeply. The precise phone call. The shifting story about the doors. The blood in the garage that no one could fully explain. But suspicion isn't proof. And proof was exactly what the case lacked. By the end of 2001, the investigation had stalled. Files thick with witness statements sat stacked in cardboard boxes. Search maps covered entire walls. But the one thing detectives needed most, a body, never appeared. Years passed. The desert winds erased old footprints. Families moved away. New residents moved into the neighborhood, unaware that a woman had vanished from the same quiet street. The Mercer house remained.
So did David.
He kept his routines, went to work, mowed his lawn, collected his mail.
Quiet.
Ordinary. Invisible. But every year, Detective Rios reopened the file. Every year, he studied the same photographs, the same footprints, the same glowing luminol patterns in that garage. And every year, he felt the same cold certainty creeping back into his mind. Emily Mercer hadn't gone for a walk. She had never left that house alive. But proving it would take far longer than anyone imagined. Because the truth about what happened on that warm Arizona night in 2000 was buried deeper than anyone realized, hidden behind years of silence, a neighborhood that saw more than it said, and a man who understood exactly how to let time erase suspicion. For nearly 2 decades, the Mercer disappearance would sit quietly inside the Phoenix Police Department archives. A cold case, one of hundreds. But what no one realized then was that the smallest detail from that first night, a pair of footprints in desert dust, would eventually reopen everything. And when the truth finally surfaced, it would shock the entire community. Because the person who knew what happened to Emily Mercer had been living in plain sight the entire time. For the next several weeks after Emily Mercer vanished, the Mercer house sat under a quiet but constant shadow. Patrol cars passed by more often than usual. Detectives returned repeatedly, each time hoping something small had been overlooked, a misplaced object, a fiber, a trace of evidence the first search had missed. But every visit ended the same way. Silence. The house never offered up the answer investigators needed. Detective Alan Rios refused to believe the case was simply a disappearance. He had worked enough homicide investigations to recognize when something violent had happened behind closed doors. And the Mercer garage still bothered him. The luminol reaction had been strong, far stronger than what you'd expect from a minor cut. Someone had lost a large amount of blood there. Yet there was no body. No drag marks. No witnesses who saw anything unusual that night. It was as if whatever happened inside that garage had been erased with surgical precision. During the second week of the investigation, detectives brought David Mercer back for another interview. This time they pushed harder. The interrogation room lights hummed faintly above them. A tape recorder clicked on. Rios placed several photographs on the table. The glowing blue luminol patterns. The footprints outside the back door. And a timeline of David's movements the night Emily disappeared. David studied the photos quietly. His posture remained controlled, almost relaxed. Then he shook his head slowly. He insisted again that he had nothing to do with his wife's disappearance. According to him, their marriage had been normal. No fights, no threats, no reason for Emily to vanish. But when detectives began asking about finances, the atmosphere in the room shifted slightly. Emily Mercer had recently taken out a life insurance policy. A large one. $200,000. David claimed it had been her idea. Security for the future, he said.
Protection in case something happened.
Rios wrote the number down in his notebook. Insurance policies were common in homicide cases. But again, suspicion wasn't proof. Without Emily's body, there was no homicide charge to file. The interview ended after 3 hours. David walked out of the police station, a free man. And over the next several months, the investigation slowly began to fade from the headlines. Local news stations had covered the story intensely at first. Arizona woman missing. Search continues in Glendale disappearance. Volunteers had formed search groups. Flyers covered telephone poles and grocery store windows. But public attention is fragile. Another story always replaces the last. By autumn of 2000, Emily Mercer's face was appearing less often on television. But inside the Mercer neighborhood, the unease remained. People noticed things. Small things. like how David Mercer rarely spoke about Emily anymore. At first, neighbors had seen him standing outside in the evenings, talking quietly with volunteers who were organizing search efforts. Then, gradually, he stopped participating. He stopped attending community meetings. He stopped answering questions. Within 6 months, David had settled back into an almost identical routine to the one he lived before Emily vanished.
Work.
Home. Quiet evenings inside. To many residents on the block, it felt unsettling. Across the street, Harold Benton still sat on his porch most nights, watching the neighborhood in the same slow, patient way he always had. And one evening in early October, he saw something that would eventually become one of the strangest details in the entire case. A truck pulled into David Mercer's driveway just after sunset. A dark pickup, older model. Benton didn't recognize the vehicle. 2 men stepped out. One of them was David. The other man was someone Benton had never seen before. They opened the garage. The door rolled upward with a loud metallic rattle. Then both men disappeared inside. The garage door closed again a minute later. Benton watched the house quietly from his porch chair. Nearly 2 hours passed. When the garage door opened again, the pickup truck backed slowly out of the driveway. The second man drove. David Mercer stood in the driveway, watching the truck leave. Then he went back inside the house. At the time, Benton didn't think much about it. But the image stayed in his mind. And months later, when detectives returned to ask new questions, Benton mentioned it. The information immediately caught Detective Rios's attention. An unknown man. A late-night visit. Access to the garage, the same place where blood had been found. Investigators tried to track down the vehicle Benton described. But the lead went cold almost instantly. There were thousands of similar trucks registered in Arizona. Without a license plate or clear description, the trail ended before it began. Still, the detail deepened the mystery. Why would David Mercer invite someone into the garage months after his wife disappeared? What exactly had happened inside that house? The longer the case dragged on, the more unsettling the unanswered questions became. Detectives began digging deeper into Emily's life. They spoke with coworkers at the medical office where she worked,
Friends.
family members. Most described her the same way.
Kind.
Reliable. Quietly ambitious. But one coworker remembered something important. About 2 weeks before she vanished, Emily had seemed anxious, distracted. When asked what was wrong, she brushed it off. Just stress at home, she said. The phrase stuck with investigators. Stress at home. They began asking friends whether Emily had ever mentioned problems in her marriage. At first, people hesitated. No one wanted to speculate about a missing woman's private life. But slowly, a pattern began to appear. Emily had confided in one close friend that David could be controlling. Not violent, at least not openly, but possessive. Jealous. He disliked when she spent time out with coworkers. He often called her repeatedly during the workday, checking where she was, who she was with. None of it was criminal, but it painted a picture. And that picture made detectives look even harder at David Mercer. They pulled phone records, bank statements, credit card activity. But again, there was nothing explosive. No sudden withdrawals. No suspicious travel. David Mercer had stayed exactly where he always was, inside the same quiet neighborhood where his wife had disappeared. By the end of 2002, the case had reached a painful stalemate. The Mercer file was thick with interviews, forensic reports, search maps, and photographs. But without a body, prosecutors refused to move forward. Reluctantly, the investigation was reclassified. Cold case. The phrase always carried a weight inside police departments. It meant time had won. For now. Detective Rios packed the Mercer file into a storage box along with dozens of other unsolved cases. But he didn't forget it. Some cases stay with investigators long after the paperwork disappears into archives. And the Mercer disappearance was one of those. Because something about that house, that garage, and that careful, emotionless 911 call still didn't make sense. Years passed. The neighborhood changed. Children grew up and moved away. New families moved into homes that had once been filled with speculation and late-night whispers. But David Mercer remained, living quietly, almost invisibly, until one morning in 2008, 8 years after Emily vanished, a construction crew working just 2 streets away would uncover something in the desert soil that would bring the Mercer case roaring back to life. Something buried. Something investigators had searched for desperately in the summer of 2000. And something that would prove, beyond any doubt, that Emily Mercer had never simply disappeared. She had been hidden, carefully, deliberately, and whoever buried her had believed the desert would keep the secret forever. 8 years is a long time for a secret to stay buried. In Arizona, the desert shifts constantly. Wind drags sand across dry ground. Flash floods carve new paths through empty washes. Old soil moves, settles, cracks open under the relentless heat. And sometimes, the desert gives something back. It happened on a Tuesday morning in April 2008. A construction crew had begun clearing land for a new housing development just outside Glendale, less than 2 miles from the Mercer neighborhood. Bulldozers pushed through dry brush and brittle cactus. Dust hung in the air like a curtain as heavy machinery scraped across the hard-packed earth. Around 10:20 a.m., one of the operators stopped his machine. At first he thought he had struck a rock. Then he saw what was sticking out of the soil.
White. Curved.
Too smooth to be stone. The foreman walked over, crouched down, and brushed dirt away with his glove. The shape became clearer. A human bone. Within an hour, the entire construction site was sealed off. Police tape stretched across the dusty clearing while investigators arrived one by one, their vehicles forming a slow procession of flashing lights along the empty road. Detective Alan Rios received the call just before noon. When he heard the location, something inside him tightened. 2 miles from the Mercer house. He didn't say anything out loud, but the thought was already forming. It couldn't be that simple. After 8 years, cases rarely solve themselves. Still, Rios drove to the scene. The desert sun was brutal that afternoon. Crime scene technicians worked slowly under white protective suits, brushing away layers of soil with delicate tools. The bulldozer had only exposed part of the remains, leaving the rest buried beneath compacted dirt. Within hours, the outline of a shallow grave began to appear. Not deep. Barely 3 feet down. Someone had dug it quickly. The skeleton was curled slightly on its side. Fragments of fabric clung to the bones, faded pieces of what had once been clothing. Rios stood just outside the tape, watching silently. He had seen many graves before, but something about this one felt different. Because of where it was, because of when it had been found, and because 8 years earlier, dozens of volunteers had searched this exact desert region looking for Emily Mercer. They had walked past this ground countless times, and yet no one had found anything. By late afternoon, the remains were carefully lifted from the grave and transported to the county medical examiner's office. Forensic anthropologists worked late into the night. Bones were cleaned, measured, examined for trauma. The skeleton belonged to a woman, roughly early 30s. And one detail immediately caught the attention of the forensic team. The skull showed signs of severe blunt force trauma. Several fractures across the left side. The injuries were catastrophic, violent, lethal. Whoever this woman was, she had not died peacefully. Detective Rios sat in his office long after midnight that night, staring at the preliminary report. Female, early 30s. Estimated time in the ground, several years. The similarities were impossible to ignore. But the identities still needed confirmation. Dental records were requested. Missing persons databases were checked. And early the next morning, investigators contacted Emily Mercer's sister in Colorado. They needed Emily's dental history. The call was devastating. For 8 years, Emily's family had lived with a terrible uncertainty, the quiet, torturous question that haunts every missing person case. Is she still alive somewhere? Or is she already gone? Now, suddenly, there was a possibility. Within 48 hours, the comparison was complete. The dental match was confirmed. The skeleton found in the desert belonged to Emily Mercer. The news spread quickly. Local television stations broke the story that evening. Human remains identified in 2000 Glendale disappearance. Missing Arizona woman confirmed dead after 8 years. The Mercer case was no longer a missing persons investigation. It was now officially a homicide. Detective Rios reopened the thick case file that had been sitting in cold storage for years. Dust clung to the cardboard box as he pulled it from the archive shelf. Inside were the same photographs, the same witness statements, the same puzzling timeline. But now there was something the investigation had never had before. A body. Forensic pathologists began a full examination of the remains. Despite the years underground, several critical details emerged. Emily had suffered multiple blows to the head from a blunt object, at least 3 separate impacts. The force had shattered portions of her skull. Death would have occurred almost immediately. Even more telling, small traces of material were discovered embedded in the bone fractures. Microscopic particles. Investigators sent the samples to a lab for analysis. While they waited for results, Rios and his team returned to the Mercer neighborhood. The atmosphere on the street changed instantly when police cars appeared again after so many years. Residents stepped outside, whispering to one another. They all remembered Emily, and they all remembered the suspicion that had once surrounded her husband. But David Mercer had moved away years earlier. In 2004, he sold the house and relocated to Nevada. Quietly, without much explanation. Detectives tracked him down in a small town outside Las Vegas. He was living alone in a modest apartment, working at an auto supply warehouse. When officers knocked on his door, David looked older than Rios remembered. His hair had thinned. Deep lines marked his face. But his reaction to the news was almost exactly the same as it had been 8 years earlier. Controlled. Measured. Rios watched him carefully as they told him Emily's remains had been found. David lowered his eyes for a moment. Then he nodded slowly, as if the confirmation was something he had expected all along. He agreed to speak with investigators again. This time the interview lasted nearly 6 hours. Detectives confronted him with the new evidence. Emily's body, the blunt force trauma, the burial site. But David repeated the same claim he had made since the night she vanished. He had nothing to do with it. Someone else must have killed her. Maybe she had encountered the wrong person during her evening walk. Maybe someone abducted her. The theories sounded hollow now, because investigators knew something David did not. The burial site. It wasn't random. When analysts mapped the location, they realized something chilling. The shallow grave was almost perfectly positioned along a quiet desert road that David Mercer had driven countless times during his daily commute in 2000. It was familiar territory. Isolated, and close enough to his home that he could reach it quickly at night. But the most disturbing discovery came several days later when the forensic lab finished analyzing the microscopic particles found in Emily's skull. The fragments were not soil. They were not rock. They were something far more specific. Paint. Industrial enamel paint. Dark gray. The kind used on heavy metal tools, or equipment, or certain types of garage hardware. Detective Rios stared at the lab report for a long time. Because 8 years earlier, in the Mercer garage, investigators had documented something else. A metal object mounted on the workbench. A heavy mechanic's mallet. Its handle worn. Its head painted dark gray. The same color described in the lab results. But that tool had never been collected as evidence. At the time, there was no body, no confirmed homicide, and no clear reason to seize it. Now, 8 years later, the tool was gone. And the one man who might have known where it went was sitting quietly in Nevada, insisting he had no idea how his wife ended up buried in the desert. But the case was no longer frozen in time. It was alive again. And this time, investigators had something they didn't have in 2000.
A grave.
A cause of death. And the growing sense that the quiet neighbor who once stood calmly on his driveway while volunteers searched for his missing wife had been hiding the truth for nearly a decade. When a cold case comes back to life, It doesn't do so quietly. It erupts. Old files reopen. Forgotten names resurface. Witnesses who once believed the past had buried everything suddenly find detectives knocking on their doors again. And for the Mercer investigation, the rediscovery of Emily's body in the desert triggered exactly that kind of awakening. Inside the Phoenix Police Department, the Mercer file was no longer a dusty archive box. It was now spread across an entire conference table in the Homicide Division. Photographs, witness statements, crime scene maps, lab reports. Every piece of the investigation was laid out again under bright fluorescent lights. Detective Alan Rios studied it all like a man revisiting a puzzle he had never truly stopped thinking about. 8 years earlier, the case had stalled because something crucial was missing. Now that missing piece had been found in the desert. Emily Mercer had been murdered. The question was no longer if a crime occurred. The question was who did it. And every road still pointed back to the same man, David Mercer, the quiet husband who had calmly reported his wife missing on a warm June night in 2000. But reopening a case after nearly a decade brought new challenges. Memories fade. Witnesses move away. Evidence disappears. And the one object detectives desperately wanted to examine, the heavy gray mallet that once sat on David Mercer's garage workbench, was gone. No one knew when it had disappeared. No one knew where it was. But the forensic lab's report had changed everything. The microscopic gray paint fragments found inside Emily's skull fractures were consistent with industrial enamel used on heavy tools and mechanical equipment. It was not definitive proof, but it was enough to raise the temperature of the investigation dramatically. Rios and his team returned once more to the Mercer neighborhood. The street looked different now. New paint on some houses. New families. Different cars in driveways. But a few original residents were still there, including Harold Benton, the elderly man who had once watched David Mercer's house from his porch. When detectives approached Benton again, he recognized Rios immediately. His memory had not faded with time. In fact, the years seemed to have sharpened certain details. Benton spoke slowly, carefully, as if replaying an old film inside his mind. He remembered the night Emily disappeared. He remembered the flashing police lights. And he still remembered the truck that had arrived at David's house months later. The dark pickup. The unknown man. But now, Benton added something he had never mentioned before. A sound. On the night Emily vanished, sometime after midnight, Benton had woken briefly. Not unusual for an older man. What woke him, he said, was the noise of a vehicle engine. He had walked to the window facing the street, and he saw David Mercer backing his car out of the driveway. Alone. The car pulled away slowly and disappeared down the dark street. At the time, Benton hadn't thought much about it. But looking back now, after learning Emily's body had been found buried in the desert, the memory felt different. Much darker. Detectives checked the old case timeline again. David Mercer had told investigators in 2000 that after calling 911, he stayed home the entire night waiting for officers to arrive. But Benton's account suggested something else entirely. David may have left the house hours earlier, possibly to dispose of a body. It wasn't proof, but it was another crack in David Mercer's carefully constructed story. Meanwhile, investigators in Nevada continued monitoring David's activities. Since the discovery of Emily's remains, he had grown noticeably more nervous. He asked questions during his police interview that detectives found revealing. Not questions about who might have killed Emily. Not questions about how she died. Instead, David asked about the burial site. How deep the grave was. Exactly where it had been located. Details that most innocent spouses might never think to ask. But detectives noticed. And they wrote everything down. Back in Arizona, forensic teams returned to the desert location where Emily's body had been discovered. Even though construction had disturbed the area, investigators hoped additional evidence might still be buried nearby. They sifted through soil, used metal detectors, examined surrounding terrain for overlooked objects. Days passed under the brutal Arizona sun. Then, during the fourth day of searching, a technician's metal detector gave a sharp signal. The object was buried about 15 feet from the grave. Carefully they dug. What emerged from the dirt was small, rust-covered, but unmistakable. A metal button, partially corroded after years underground. Crime scene technicians placed it into an evidence bag and photographed the location. The button appeared to have once belonged to a shirt or jacket. Later that evening, detectives compared it with old photographs taken during the original search of the Mercer home in 2000. One image showed a laundry basket sitting inside the master bedroom. Inside the basket was a work shirt belonging to David Mercer. Dark blue, industrial style, and missing a button near the collar. When Rios saw the photo comparison, he leaned back in his chair slowly. The button recovered from the desert soil matched the size, color, and design of the missing one from David's shirt. It wasn't a perfect forensic match yet. Corrosion made detailed comparison difficult. But the implication was clear. David Mercer may have been present at the burial site. The case was tightening, but prosecutors still needed something stronger. Circumstantial evidence alone rarely secured a conviction in a murder case without eyewitnesses. And the clock had already been running for 8 long years. Detectives began looking for the one thing that could break the case open. A witness. Someone who had seen or heard something that night. Someone who had stayed silent for years. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. In early 2009, a woman named Laura Bennett contacted Phoenix police after seeing a news report about Emily Mercer's remains being discovered. At first, detectives assumed she might have been another distant acquaintance, offering vague memories. But during the phone call, Laura said something that instantly changed the tone of the conversation. She used to date David Mercer. Not before Emily disappeared.
After.
In fact, Laura had been in a relationship with David for nearly a year, starting just months after Emily vanished. And, according to her, during that relationship David had said something late one night that she had never been able to forget. Something he said while drinking heavily. A sentence spoken almost like a confession. Detectives arranged to meet Laura the following day. Inside an interview room, she sat nervously across from them. She explained that during their relationship, David rarely spoke about Emily. When he did, he always described her disappearance as a tragic mystery. But one night, during an argument in David's kitchen, he had lost his temper. And in that moment, Laura said, his words had turned chilling. He leaned close to her and whispered something that froze her completely. "People disappear in the desert all the time," he said. Then he smiled. A slow, quiet smile. And sometimes they stay there forever. At the time, Laura had dismissed it as drunken anger. But when she saw the news report about Emily Mercer's body being found in the desert, the memory came rushing back. Detective Rios felt a cold certainty settle in his chest as Laura finished her statement. Because if David Mercer truly believed the desert would keep his secret forever, he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. The desert had already begun to give the truth back. And the more investigators dug into the past, the clearer the picture was becoming. A violent night inside a quiet garage. A hurried burial under desert soil. And a man who had spent nearly a decade believing time would erase the crime. But time doesn't erase everything. Sometimes it simply waits. And in the Mercer case, the past was about to return with a force David Mercer could never have predicted. Cold cases rarely break open with a single dramatic revelation. More often, they unravel slowly, thread by thread, detail by detail, until the truth that once hid comfortably in the shadows can no longer stay there. By early 2009, the Mercer investigation had reached a turning point. For 8 years, the case had been little more than suspicion and unanswered questions. Now investigators had something far more dangerous for the man at the center of it all, a growing web of evidence that was beginning to connect. Emily Mercer's body had been found. Her death had been ruled a homicide. Forensic fragments suggested a blunt weapon. A button matching one from David Mercer's shirt had been discovered near the burial site. And now a former girlfriend had come forward with a statement that hinted at something chilling. David Mercer may have believed his secret was safely buried in the Arizona desert. Detective Alan Rios knew that building a murder case nearly a decade after the crime required patience and precision. One wrong move could destroy what little advantage investigators had gained. So the strategy changed. Instead of confronting David immediately, detectives began quietly reconstructing every detail of his life during the months surrounding Emily's disappearance. They examined work records, bank statements, phone logs, old utility bills, even grocery store receipts. Every ordinary piece of paper became potential evidence. And slowly, patterns began to emerge. In the summer of 2000, David Mercer worked as a maintenance technician at an auto parts warehouse on the outskirts of Glendale. It was the kind of job that involved long hours around heavy equipment, tools, and mechanical supplies, including industrial enamel paint, the same type of paint whose microscopic fragments had been found embedded in Emily's skull. Investigators visited the warehouse where David once worked. The building itself had changed ownership over the years, but several employees who worked there in 2000 were still around. One of them, a supervisor named Carl Denson, remembered David clearly. "Quiet guy," Denson said during the interview. "Kept to himself mostly. Worked hard. Never caused trouble." But when detectives asked about the tools used at the warehouse, Denson nodded toward the maintenance area. They kept a variety of heavy tools there: mallets, hammers, steel bars, equipment used to repair machinery, and storage racks. And many of those tools had dark gray enamel coatings to prevent rust. Detective Rios walked slowly through the maintenance area, studying the racks of equipment. A heavy mallet sat on one shelf, its metal head coated in the same dull gray enamel. The resemblance to the tool once seen in David Mercer's garage was impossible to ignore. But again, there was a problem. No one could prove the murder weapon had come from here. No one could prove the fragments in Emily's skull came from David's tool. After nearly a decade, the trail of physical evidence had grown thin, which meant investigators needed something else. A mistake. And sometimes, the pressure of a reopening case is exactly what pushes someone to make one. In Nevada, David Mercer had begun to sense the investigation closing in around him. Since detectives interviewed him again after Emily's remains were discovered, his behavior had changed. Neighbors at his apartment complex noticed he seemed restless. He left his apartment late at night more often. He began making long phone calls that ended abruptly when people entered the room. And perhaps most telling of all, he started talking about moving again. This time, possibly out of state. Detectives monitoring the situation realized something important. If David was preparing to run, they might lose their chance to gather more information. So they made a decision. They would apply pressure, but carefully. In February 2009, Phoenix police publicly announced that the Mercer investigation was now an active homicide case. The news aired across Arizona television stations. Reporters repeated the same chilling details. Emily Mercer's remains had been found. The case was being aggressively reopened, and detectives believed someone close to her knew what happened. The statement wasn't directed at the public. It was directed at one man. In Nevada, David Mercer watched the broadcast from his living room. Investigators would later learn that he made 3 phone calls that night. The first was to an old coworker, the second to his sister in Oregon. The third call lasted nearly 40 minutes. And the person on the other end of that call would soon become one of the most important witnesses in the case. Her name was Rachel Collins. She had known David Mercer for years, not as a romantic partner, but as a friend from a local community group he joined after moving to Nevada. Rachel later told investigators that David called her late that evening sounding agitated. Not frightened, agitated. At first, he talked about the news report. He complained that police were harassing him. He insisted he had done nothing wrong. But as the conversation continued, something strange happened. David began asking questions. Not about the investigation itself. About the desert. Rachel remembered the questions clearly because they seemed so oddly specific. "Do bodies decompose faster in dry heat?" he asked. "How long do bones stay intact underground? Would animals dig up a shallow grave?" At the time, Rachel didn't think too deeply about the questions. But when detectives contacted her weeks later and asked if David had said anything unusual during their friendship, the memory came flooding back. And suddenly those questions didn't sound curious anymore. They sounded like the worries of someone whose secret had just been uncovered. Meanwhile, investigators in Arizona made another discovery while reviewing old evidence from the Mercer home. In 2000, technicians had collected several small carpet fibers from the trunk of David Mercer's car. At the time, the samples meant nothing. There was no body, no proof Emily had been inside the vehicle. But now that her remains had been located in the desert, forensic analysts compared those fibers to material recovered from Emily's clothing. The match was not perfect. Years underground had degraded much of the fabric. But the fibers were consistent. The same color, the same weave. It suggested something investigators had long suspected. Emily Mercer's body may have been transported in David Mercer's car the night she disappeared. When Detective Rios reviewed the updated forensic report, he felt the investigation shifting again. Piece by piece, the narrative was forming. A violent attack inside the Mercer garage. A body placed into a vehicle. A late-night drive into the desert. A shallow grave dug quickly under cover of darkness. And a husband who calmly reported his wife, missing hours later. But there was still one question haunting the entire case.
Why?
What had happened inside that quiet house that summer night? What argument or secret had escalated into such sudden, brutal violence? Investigators began revisiting Emily Mercer's personal life more carefully than ever before.
Friends.
Co-workers. Family. Anyone who might have known something about the final weeks of her life. And slowly, another piece of the story began to surface. A piece that no one had fully understood back in 2000. Emily Mercer had been planning something. Something she had not yet told her husband. Something that might explain why the calm, careful man who called 911 that night suddenly had everything to lose. Secrets have a way of surfacing long after the people who tried to hide them believe the danger has passed. Sometimes they appear quietly, buried in old paperwork or forgotten conversations. Other times they arrive like a shockwave that changes the entire direction of an investigation. For the Mercer case, that shockwave came from something small. A piece of paper that had sat unnoticed for nearly 9 years. It was discovered during a routine review of Emily Mercer's personal records. Detectives had already gone through her bank accounts and employment files years earlier, but reopening the case meant every document had to be examined again with fresh eyes. Inside a storage box that had been returned to Emily's sister after the disappearance, investigators found a sealed envelope. The handwriting on the front belonged to Emily. The envelope had never been mailed. Inside was a letter. Not a long one. Just 2 pages. But the words written on those pages would reshape the entire narrative of what might have happened inside the Mercer home on that summer night in 2000. Emily had written the letter to her sister, Claire. The tone was cautious at first, the kind of careful language someone uses when they are unsure how to explain something difficult. She wrote that things with David had become tense. Not violent, but uncomfortable. Controlling. He checked her phone messages. Asked questions about where she went after work. Became irritated when she stayed late with coworkers. Then, halfway through the letter, Emily revealed the real reason she had begun writing. She was planning to leave him. Not immediately, but soon. Emily wrote that she had been saving money quietly and was looking into transferring to another medical office in Tucson where a friend had offered to help her find a job. She said she hadn't told David yet. She was afraid of how he might react. The letter ended with a line that chilled detectives when they read it. "I just need a little more time to figure everything out. I don't think he would take the news well." Detective Alan Rios sat silently for a long moment after reading the letter. Because suddenly the timeline of the Mercer case looked very different. If Emily Mercer had been planning to leave her husband, and if David had somehow discovered that plan, the quiet, controlled man everyone described might have faced a moment of explosive anger that night. A moment violent enough to change 2 lives forever. Investigators began searching for any indication that David Mercer knew about Emily's plan. They returned to her workplace and interviewed coworkers again. One nurse remembered something that now seemed incredibly important. About a week before Emily disappeared, she had asked the office manager for copies of her employment records. At the time, she said it was for personal paperwork. But now the request made sense. Emily had likely been preparing documents for a job application somewhere else. Perhaps Tucson. Perhaps somewhere even farther away. Detectives also learned that Emily had visited a small apartment complex across town just 4 days before her disappearance. She had spoken with the property manager about rental availability. The manager remembered her clearly. Emily had seemed nervous, almost secretive, when she asked whether the lease paperwork could be prepared quickly if she decided to move in. When investigators compared the date of that visit to the timeline of events inside the Mercer home, a disturbing possibility emerged. Emily Mercer may have been just days away from leaving. And if David had discovered that fact, the confrontation inside their home could have become explosive. Meanwhile, in Nevada, David Mercer continued living under the growing shadow of the reopened investigation. News coverage in Arizona had intensified after Emily's remains were identified. Television reporters now openly described David as the primary person of interest. Although he had not been charged with a crime, the pressure was building. Detectives noticed that David had begun changing his routine again. He called in sick to work more frequently. He avoided conversations with neighbors. And according to one coworker, he had started drinking heavily after shifts ended. Sometimes people carry guilt for years without visible cracks. But once the past resurfaces, those cracks begin to widen. One evening in March 2009, David Mercer made another phone call. This time it was to his sister, Margaret, who lived in Oregon. The conversation lasted less than 20 minutes. But Margaret would later describe the tone of the call as deeply unsettling. David sounded tired, agitated, almost defeated. At one point, he asked her a strange question. If someone makes a mistake, a terrible mistake, does it ever stop following you? Margaret didn't know how to answer. She assumed he was talking about the renewed police attention surrounding Emily's case. But before the call ended, David said something else. Something that would later echo through the entire investigation. They're digging everything up again, he said quietly. And the desert doesn't hide things forever. Back in Arizona, detectives were preparing their next move. They now had several pieces of a puzzle that had been scattered for years. Emily's plan to leave her husband. The blunt force trauma to her skull. Evidence suggesting her body had been transported in David's vehicle. A button linking him to the burial site. And multiple statements from people who had heard David make disturbing remarks about bodies in the desert. Individually, none of the evidence guaranteed a conviction. But together, the picture was becoming clearer. The Mercer case was no longer a vague mystery. It was beginning to resemble a very specific story. A marriage collapsing behind closed doors. A confrontation late at night. A burst of violence inside a quiet suburban garage. And a husband who had spent nearly a decade believing he had buried the truth deep enough that no one would ever find it. But the desert had already started giving that truth back. And investigators knew something David Mercer did not. They had just uncovered one final piece of evidence hidden inside the Mercer house itself. A detail so small it had gone completely unnoticed in 2000. But now, nearly 9 years later, it might become the final thread connecting David Mercer directly to the night his wife died. Because sometimes the smallest traces survive the longest. And in this case, one forgotten stain inside a quiet Arizona garage was about to reopen the most violent moment of the entire story. For nearly 9 years, the Mercer house had stood quietly at the end of the street, its secrets sealed behind freshly painted walls and new owners who had no connection to the tragedy that once unfolded there. To most people in the neighborhood, it was simply another home with another family living inside it. But to Detective Alan Rios, the house had never stopped being a crime scene. The discovery of Emily Mercer's remains had changed the entire investigation. It meant detectives could now reconstruct the crime not as a disappearance, but as a murder. And when investigators reviewed the original photographs from inside the Mercer garage taken in 2000, something that once seemed insignificant suddenly became impossible to ignore. A stain. It appeared faint in the images, a small, dark discoloration on the concrete floor near the workbench. At the time, technicians had tested the area quickly. The results had been inconclusive. Without a body, without proof of violence, there had been no reason to treat the garage as a homicide scene. But now there was a body. And now the stain meant something entirely different. In April 2009, detectives contacted the current homeowners and explained the situation. The couple living there had moved into the house 3 years earlier and were shocked to learn the full history of the property. They had heard rumors about the disappearance years ago, but nothing more. They agreed to allow forensic investigators inside. When the technicians arrived, they immediately noticed something interesting. The garage floor had been repainted at some point since the original investigation. A thin coat of gray industrial sealant now covered the concrete surface. But paint cannot erase everything. Under powerful forensic lighting, the floor revealed subtle irregularities, faint shapes where the sealant had soaked into the concrete differently. Technicians began a careful chemical test along the area where the old photographs had shown the stain. Within minutes, the solution reacted. A faint blue glow spread across the floor under the dimmed lights. Luminol, a chemical used to detect trace amounts of blood even years after it has been cleaned. The glow expanded slowly as technicians sprayed a wider area. It revealed a disturbing pattern. Not just one stain. Several. Small droplets scattered across the concrete near the workbench. And one larger concentration directly beside it. Detective Rios felt a quiet chill run through him as he watched the reaction spread under the blue light. Blood had once soaked into that floor, and someone had tried very hard to hide it. Forensic technicians began collecting samples immediately. Tiny sections of the concrete were carefully drilled out and sealed as evidence. Even after nearly a decade, there was a possibility that microscopic traces of DNA might still exist inside the porous material. While the forensic team worked inside the garage, Rios stood outside the house, looking at the quiet street. He imagined the night Emily Mercer disappeared. The argument that may have begun in the kitchen or living room. Voices rising. Anger building. Then perhaps Emily stepping into the garage, maybe trying to leave, maybe trying to escape the confrontation. And David Mercer following her. The workbench stood only a few feet away from the place where the luminol had reacted most strongly. On that bench, investigators had once photographed the heavy gray mechanic's mallet. A tool designed for striking metal. A tool capable of delivering devastating force. And now, forensic evidence suggested blood had once splattered across that very floor. The pieces were aligning. But there was still a problem. Investigators needed to prove that the blood belonged to Emily Mercer. And after so many years, recovering usable DNA from the concrete would not be easy. The samples were rushed to a specialized forensic laboratory. The waiting began. Meanwhile, pressure continued building around David Mercer. News outlets had begun reporting the reopening of the case with renewed intensity. Emily's letter about planning to leave her husband had been leaked to reporters, adding a powerful new motive to the public narrative. Headlines appeared across Arizona. Missing woman planned to leave husband before disappearance. Cold case murder investigation focuses on spouse. Although David had not been formally charged, the spotlight was now fixed firmly on him. In Nevada, he felt it. Neighbors described him as increasingly withdrawn. He stopped attending the community meetings where he once spent his evenings. He avoided social gatherings and rarely spoke to anyone outside of work. Then something else happened. In late April 2009, David Mercer suddenly resigned from his job at the auto supply warehouse. No explanation. Just a brief conversation with his supervisor and a quiet departure. Detectives monitoring his activity grew concerned. People who leave jobs abruptly during a homicide investigation sometimes have a reason.
Fear.
Pressure. Or plans to disappear. Authorities in Nevada were alerted to watch David closely. But before any arrest could occur, investigators in Arizona needed the forensic results from the Mercer garage. 3 weeks later, the lab report arrived. Detective Rios opened the file in his office and read it slowly. Forensic analysts had successfully extracted a partial DNA profile from the blood traces inside the concrete samples. It was degraded, fragmented, but there was enough genetic material to compare against known samples. Investigators used DNA obtained from Emily Mercer's personal belongings stored by her family. A toothbrush, a hairbrush. The comparison was completed within days. The result came back with a high probability match. The blood on the Mercer garage floor belonged to Emily. After 9 years, the quiet garage had finally spoken, and its message was unmistakable. Emily Mercer had bled there.
Badly.
Violently. Detective Rios closed the lab report and leaned back in his chair. For the first time since the case reopened, the investigation had something close to physical proof. Emily had likely been attacked inside that garage. Her blood had soaked into the floor, and her body had later been transported into the desert. Now the remaining question was simple. Could prosecutors convince a jury that David Mercer was the one who swung the weapon? Because while the evidence was building, David still insisted on the same story he had told since 2000. He had nothing to do with Emily's death. He claimed someone else must have taken her. Someone else must have killed her. But investigators were preparing to challenge that claim in the most direct way possible. They were about to bring David Mercer back to Arizona. Back to the city where his wife vanished. Back to the house where her blood had stained the garage floor. Because the case had finally reached the moment detectives had been working toward for nearly a decade. The moment when the quiet neighbor who once watched search teams comb through the desert for his missing wife would finally be forced to answer the question that had haunted the Mercer case from the very beginning. What really happened inside that garage on the night Emily Mercer died? By the summer of 2009, the Mercer case was no longer a quiet investigation buried in old police files. It had become something much louder, a cold case resurrection that was now drawing attention across Arizona. News stations ran the story repeatedly. A woman missing for nearly a decade, a shallow grave discovered in the desert, blood evidence inside the family garage, and a husband who had quietly moved to another state. For Detective Alan Rios, however, the headlines were only noise. What mattered was the evidence, and the evidence was finally beginning to form a narrative strong enough to challenge David Mercer's version of events. Emily Mercer had bled inside the garage. Her remains had been buried in the desert along a route David once drove regularly. Fragments of gray industrial paint inside her skull suggested a heavy tool. And witnesses now described a man increasingly nervous about the desert revealing what he believed it had hidden. But even with all of that, prosecutors still needed something more, something direct enough to convince a jury that the quiet husband who calmly reported his wife missing had, in fact, been the one who ended her life. And so investigators decided to confront him again. This time, not casually. This time with the full weight of the evidence laid out in front of him. In July 2009, 2 Phoenix homicide detectives traveled to Nevada. The desert heat there felt almost identical to Arizona's. The same dry wind, the same endless horizon, the same silence that seemed to stretch across miles of empty land. They arrived at David Mercer's apartment early in the morning. He opened the door slowly. For a moment, the 3 men simply stood there. David looked thinner than he had during the last interview months earlier. His shoulders seemed tense, his eyes tired. But when the detectives introduced themselves again, his voice remained calm. He agreed to come down to the station voluntarily. The interview room inside the Las Vegas police building was small and bright. A recorder sat in the center of the table. David Mercer sat on one side. Detectives Rios and Keller sat across from him. At first, the conversation felt familiar. The same questions, the same answers. David repeated his story again. The evening walk, the missing wife, the mysterious disappearance. But then the detectives began placing evidence on the table. First, the photographs of Emily's burial site. Then the forensic report describing the blunt force trauma to her skull. David's eyes flickered briefly across the images, but his expression barely changed. Next came the photograph of the garage floor glowing under luminol. That was when something shifted. David leaned back slightly in his chair. He didn't speak for several seconds. Then he asked a question. How do you know that's from Emily? Detective Rios slid the DNA report across the table. The silence that followed stretched longer. But David still did not confess. Instead, he shook his head slowly. I don't know how that got there, he said. The detectives expected resistance. What they were watching for was something else, cracks in the story. So they kept going. They showed him the photograph of the metal button found near the desert grave. Then they showed him the old image of his work shirt from 2000, the one missing the same button. For the first time, David looked unsettled. He rubbed his hands together slowly. But still, he denied everything. Then Detective Keller introduced the next piece of evidence. Emily's letter. The one she had written to her sister about planning to leave. Rios watched David carefully as Keller read several lines aloud. The effect was immediate. David's jaw tightened. His calm expression hardened into something colder. For nearly 9 years, he had maintained the image of a grieving husband whose wife vanished mysteriously. But now the narrative was different. Now the detectives were presenting him with a motive. And that was when David made his first real mistake. He leaned forward suddenly. She never told me that, he said. The words came out too quickly. Too defensive. Because the detectives had never said he knew about the letter. They had only described its contents. Rios noticed the slip instantly. A man who truly believed his wife had simply vanished might react with shock or confusion. But David's reaction suggested something else entirely. He reacted like someone who had been personally betrayed. The conversation grew more tense after that. Detectives pressed harder. They asked about the garage, about the blood, about the desert burial. David's answers became shorter, colder. Eventually, he stopped answering some questions altogether. Nearly 5 hours into the interview, he finally said something that caused both detectives to exchange a glance. I've told you everything I know, he said quietly. Then he added another sentence, one that would later appear in court transcripts. You're trying to make this look like I killed her. Detective Rios responded calmly. We're trying to understand how your wife's blood ended up in your garage and her body ended up buried in the desert. David didn't answer. The room fell silent again. Eventually, the interview ended without a confession. David Mercer walked out of the station that afternoon still a free man. But something important had changed. The detectives had watched him react to the evidence. They had seen the cracks forming. And most importantly, prosecutors reviewing the interview footage believed the case was now strong enough to move forward. Back in Arizona, the county attorney's office began preparing the next step. An arrest warrant. Nearly 9 years after Emily Mercer vanished into the warm Arizona night, investigators believed they were finally ready to accuse someone of her murder. But before that warrant could be issued, one more piece of the puzzle surfaced, a detail that would give prosecutors the final confidence they needed. It came from a place no one had expected. A storage unit. One David Mercer had rented shortly after Emily disappeared. And inside that unit, investigators were about to discover an object that had been missing from the case since the very beginning. The weapon that may have delivered the fatal blows. The heavy gray mallet that once sat quietly on a garage workbench. The same tool that vanished just days after Emily Mercer was reported missing. And if it truly was the murder weapon, it meant something terrifying. For nearly a decade, David Mercer may have kept the instrument of his wife's death hidden just a few miles from the home where it all began. Cold cases rarely move in straight lines. Just when investigators believe they have assembled every piece of the puzzle, something unexpected appears, a new thread, a forgotten detail, a place no one thought to look before. For nearly 9 years, detectives had searched for the object they believed started everything. The heavy gray mallet that once rested on David Mercer's garage workbench. Neighbors had seen it. Crime scene photographs had captured it. And then, sometime after Emily Mercer disappeared, it vanished. Without the weapon, prosecutors knew their case would always rely heavily on circumstantial evidence. Strong evidence. Yes, blood in the garage, a desert grave, suspicious statements, but still circumstantial. If the weapon could be found, the case might transform overnight. The break came from an administrative audit. Not from a dramatic discovery in the field, but from a quiet office inside the Phoenix Police Department where investigators were reviewing financial records connected to David Mercer's life after 2000. Detective Alan Rios had asked a junior analyst to examine David's bank activity again. The purpose was simple: track where he had spent money during the weeks following Emily's disappearance. Sometimes, people trying to hide a crime make small logistical decisions that leave behind financial footprints. Most of David's spending looked ordinary. Groceries,
Gas,
hardware stores. But one transaction stood out. 5 days after Emily was reported missing, David Mercer had rented a small storage unit on the north side of Phoenix. At the time, investigators in 2000 had noticed the rental but dismissed it quickly. David had explained that he needed space to store old tools and equipment from the garage while he reorganized the house. Without a murder investigation, there had been no reason to question the explanation further. But now, in 2009, that storage unit suddenly looked different. Detectives contacted the storage facility. The original unit had long since been emptied, but the management company kept detailed records of renters and, more importantly, records of what happened when tenants failed to close accounts properly. The facility manager explained something interesting. David Mercer had stopped paying the rental fee after only 3 months. When that happens, storage companies typically auction off the contents to recover unpaid fees. But in this case, something unusual occurred. The auction had been canceled.
Why?
Because David returned one final time before the auction date and removed the contents himself. He had closed the account in person. Detective Rios asked the obvious question. "Do you remember what he took out of the unit?" The manager shook his head at first. 9 years had passed. But then he paused. Something about the question seemed to stir an old memory. "Yes," the manager said slowly. There was a long metal toolbox. The words instantly caught the attention of the entire investigation team. A metal toolbox could contain anything: wrenches, pliers, mechanical equipment, or possibly the one object detectives had spent nearly a decade searching for. But the bigger question was this: where had David taken the toolbox after removing it from storage? Investigators returned once again to David Mercer's financial history. They looked for purchases, travel records, any hint of where he might have relocated the contents. And then another clue appeared. Just weeks after emptying the storage unit in 2000, David Mercer had purchased a used pickup truck. It was not the car he originally owned when Emily disappeared. This was a different vehicle, bought cheaply from a private seller. The truck itself had long since been sold again. But investigators tracked down the man who purchased it from David years later. His name was Robert Haynes. When detectives contacted Haynes, he remembered the truck immediately. It had been an older model, nothing special. But when he bought it from David, there had been something unusual in the truck bed. A locked metal toolbox bolted near the cab. Haynes said David told him the toolbox was empty. He insisted it wasn't worth removing. So the toolbox stayed with the truck. Detective Rios felt his pulse quicken as the story unfolded. "Do you still have it?" he asked. Haynes hesitated. "No," he said. "But I know where it went." The truck had eventually been sold again to another buyer in Nevada. And the toolbox had gone with it. For investigators, the possibility was electrifying. If the toolbox still existed, if it had never been opened, there was a chance the missing murder weapon had been sitting unnoticed for years. Detectives moved quickly. Through registration records and vehicle databases, they tracked the truck to its current owner, a construction worker named Daniel Price living outside Las Vegas. Within days, officers visited Price's property. The truck was still there, rusty now, faded by years of desert sun. But the metal toolbox remained bolted in the truck bed exactly where Haynes had described it. Price allowed officers to examine it. The toolbox was locked, and according to Price, he had never opened it. He had assumed it belonged to the previous owner and simply left it alone. Detective Rios stood beside the truck as a technician prepared to remove the lock. The desert wind blew dust across the dry ground. For a moment, no one spoke. 9 years of investigation had led to this moment. If the weapon was inside, it would mean the man who buried Emily Mercer had unknowingly carried the evidence with him across state lines for nearly a decade. The lock snapped open with a sharp metallic crack. Slowly, the lid of the toolbox lifted. Inside were several tools, wrenches, a rusted crowbar, a pair of gloves, and beneath them, wrapped loosely in an old cloth, something heavier. The technician pulled it free. Gray metal, thick handle, a broad striking head coated in chipped enamel paint, a mechanic's mallet. The room fell silent as investigators stared at it. Even before forensic testing, they recognized it immediately. The same type of tool neighbors had once seen resting on David Mercer's garage workbench. The same type of tool capable of delivering the blunt force trauma that had fractured Emily Mercer's skull. Detective Rios exhaled slowly. For 9 years, the weapon had traveled quietly across Arizona and Nevada, hidden in plain sight. Now it sat inside an evidence bag. And if forensic testing revealed traces of blood or DNA, the case that had haunted investigators for nearly a decade would finally have its most powerful piece of proof. But as the mallet was carefully sealed and sent to the laboratory, another realization settled quietly over the investigation. David Mercer had kept the weapon. He hadn't thrown it away. He hadn't buried it in the desert. He had carried it with him, which meant something unsettling. For nearly 9 years after his wife vanished, the man suspected of killing her may have been living every day with the very object that ended her life sitting only a few feet away. The years did not pass quietly in Mesa. They piled up like dust on forgotten evidence boxes, thick and stubborn, settling over every unanswered question left behind by the 2000 cold case.
Seasons changed.
Children who had once ridden bicycles through the neighborhood grew into adults with families of their own. Houses were repainted, lawns were reshaped, new streetlights were installed. Yet beneath the normal rhythm of suburban life, the memory of that night remained suspended in time. The house on East Evergreen Street stood almost unchanged. Neighbors still pointed to it when the story came up, lowering their voices as if the walls might still hear. The driveway, where police cars had once crowded bumper to bumper. The front yard where crime scene tape had fluttered in the desert wind. The bedroom window investigators had photographed again and again. For years, that house was the silent center of a mystery that refused to die. The victim's name still appeared occasionally in local newspapers when journalists wrote about unsolved crimes that haunted Arizona. The article titles were familiar phrases now. Cold case still open, investigators searching for answers community remembers. But nothing moved the case forward. Inside the Mesa Police Department, the file slowly migrated to a section known by every detective, the Cold Case Unit. A quiet room where shelves sagged under the weight of decades-old tragedies. Boxes, photos, transcripts, evidence bags sealed long ago. Every item told the same story, a crime that had stopped time. Detective Maria Alvarez first opened the Evergreen file on a late afternoon in the summer of 2018. She had joined the Cold Case Unit after 15 years in homicide. By then, she had seen nearly every kind of violence imaginable, but cold cases were different. They carried a different kind of silence. These were crimes that had waited for technology, waited for memory to resurface, waited for someone to notice the one detail everyone else had missed. When Alvarez pulled the Evergreen case box from the shelf, a thin layer of dust rose into the air. Inside were hundreds of photographs. The bedroom, the hallway, the kitchen sink, the front yard under flashing police lights. She flipped slowly through them. Nothing unusual at first glance. Everything looked like the careful, methodical documentation of a normal homicide scene. But something about the case bothered her immediately. There was no forced entry. That fact had been written in bold letters on the first page of the investigative summary. No signs of break-in. Alvarez leaned back in her chair. That single line changed the entire shape of a crime. Because it meant one thing investigators always dreaded. The killer might have been someone the victim knew. She continued reading through witness statements taken in the hours after the body had been discovered. Neighbors described the same thing. A quiet evening. No arguments. No gunshots. No screams. Just an ambulance arriving after midnight and police cars filling the street. The victim had been discovered by a relative who stopped by unexpectedly. The report described the scene with cold precision. The victim lying on the bedroom floor, signs of struggle, evidence collected and photographed. The autopsy had determined the cause of death quickly. Homicide. Blunt force trauma. Alvarez closed the folder slowly. She had seen that phrase many times before. It was brutal, personal, violent. The kind of crime that rarely happened between strangers. She turned to the evidence inventory. One page caught her eye. A small plastic bag containing something investigators had labeled but never fully examined using modern techniques. Trace material recovered from the victim's clothing. In 2000, forensic science had been far less advanced than it was now. DNA testing existed, but it required larger samples. Tiny traces often went untested because laboratories simply couldn't extract enough genetic material.
But times had changed.
In 2018, forensic labs could recover DNA from samples once considered useless. Alvarez stared at the evidence log. Then she stood up and carried the box across the room to the forensic review desk. The technician on duty looked up. "Another cold one?" he asked. She nodded. "Maybe not for long." The bag was opened under strict lab protocol. Inside was a small fiber fragment and several microscopic skin cells preserved during the original evidence collection. For years they had been ignored. Now they were placed carefully into a new testing process. The waiting began. Weeks passed before the results came back. When the lab technician walked into Alvarez's office holding the report, the tension in the room changed instantly. He didn't say anything at first. He just placed the paper on the desk. Alvarez read the top line. DNA profile successfully extracted. Her pulse quickened. This was the moment every cold case investigator hoped for, the moment when science reached backward through time and grabbed hold of the truth. But there was another problem. The DNA profile didn't match anyone in the National Criminal Database. No arrests. No prior convictions. No known offenders. Whoever left that DNA had never been caught before, which meant investigators needed another approach. In recent years, a controversial but powerful tool had begun solving cases once thought impossible. Genetic genealogy. The process was complex but revolutionary. Instead of searching only criminal databases, investigators could compare unknown DNA to public ancestry databases used by millions of ordinary people. Relatives, distant cousins, shared genetic markers. By tracing family trees backward, investigators could sometimes narrow a suspect down to a single person. The Evergreen case became a candidate for the process. But the analysis would take months. Genealogists began mapping genetic connections across databases, building enormous family trees that stretched across states and generations. The work was slow and meticulous. Branches expanded. Names multiplied. Connections formed. Little by little, the possible pool of suspects narrowed. And eventually, the family tree pointed toward a small group of individuals living in Arizona around the year 2000. One name on that list caught Alvarez's attention immediately. Not because he had a criminal record. Not because he had been interviewed by police. But because of something far more unsettling. His address in 2000. East Evergreen Street. 3 houses away from the victim. Alvarez stared at the screen for several seconds. The quiet neighbor. A man who had lived just steps from the crime scene. Someone investigators had spoken to briefly during the original neighborhood canvass. Just another resident answering routine questions. His statement back then had been simple. He had heard nothing. Seen nothing. Gone to bed early. His name appeared only once in the entire investigative file. 1 paragraph. 1 short interview. And then he disappeared from the case entirely. Alvarez printed the page and walked it down the hall. Within hours, the cold case unit began rebuilding the timeline around that man's life. Employment records. Property records. Old photographs. Neighbors who remembered him. What they found was chilling in its simplicity. For decades, he had lived quietly. No arrests, no violence, no reason for suspicion. Just a quiet neighbor living an ordinary life. But now the DNA evidence suggested something very different. Investigators knew they needed one more confirmation before taking action. They needed a direct DNA sample. The problem was how to obtain it without alerting him. Surveillance began quietly. Detectives followed his daily routine for weeks. Morning coffee,
Work.
evening walks, trips to the grocery store. An ordinary life. But eventually, opportunity appeared in the most mundane way imaginable. One evening, the man stopped at a fast food restaurant and threw away a paper cup after finishing his drink. Detectives retrieved it from the trash. The cup was rushed to the lab. And when the DNA comparison came back, the results sent a shock through the Mesa Police Department. The match was conclusive. The quiet neighbor had been present at the crime scene the night the victim died. After nearly 2 decades, the cold case was suddenly alive again. Detectives began preparing an arrest warrant. But as the investigation moved forward, another disturbing question emerged. If the neighbor's DNA was at the scene, why had no one suspected him before? And what had really happened inside that house on Evergreen Street all those years ago? Because the deeper investigators looked into the quiet neighbor's past, the more unsettling the story became. And what they discovered next would shake the entire community once again. By the time the arrest warrant was signed, the Evergreen Street case had already begun to stir memories that many people in Mesa had tried to bury. Detectives moved carefully, aware that after 20 years the truth would not arrive quietly. It would land like thunder in a community that had long convinced itself the past was sealed. Surveillance continued for several more days. Silent cars parked at the edge of neighborhoods, detectives drinking lukewarm coffee while watching the small house where the quiet neighbor had lived most of his life. Nothing about him suggested violence. He watered his lawn. He waved politely to people walking dogs in the evening. He drove an aging pickup truck to work every morning. If a stranger had passed him in a grocery store aisle, there would have been no second glance. That ordinariness made the case even more unsettling. On a cool morning in October, the operation finally moved. Detectives gathered before sunrise, reviewing the plan one last time. The suspect's routine had been studied for weeks. He left his house every morning at 7:12 a.m. Almost precisely. Coffee in hand, the keys in his left pocket. The same rhythm every day. Patrol units waited quietly at the end of the street. An unmarked vehicle idled nearby. The air was calm, the sky pale with the first light of dawn. At exactly 7:11, the front door opened. The man stepped outside, closing the door behind him without looking back. He paused on the porch the same way he always did, taking a sip from his travel mug. Then he walked toward the driveway. Detectives moved in. The moment was fast, controlled, almost quiet. One officer stepped forward and called his name. The man froze, confusion spreading across his face as more officers approached. When they told him he was under arrest for a murder committed in the year 2000, witnesses later said his expression didn't change immediately. It was as if the words needed time to travel through 20 years of silence before they reached him. He didn't run. He didn't fight. He simply stared. Neighbors began stepping outside their homes, drawn by the sight of police cars blocking the street. Some watched from their front lawns, others from behind curtains. Slowly, whispers moved from house to house as officers placed handcuffs around the wrists of a man many of them had greeted for years. The quiet neighbor. The same man who had once told investigators he heard nothing the night the victim died. Within hours, the news spread across Mesa. Television stations interrupted their morning broadcasts with breaking headlines. Online articles appeared with bold letters that many people had not expected to see again. Arizona 2000 cold case solved. Quiet neighbor arrested in decades OLD murder. The words traveled quickly through social media, through coffee shops, through office buildings. For older residents, the story reopened memories that had never fully disappeared. They remembered the flashing police lights, the yellow tape stretching across Evergreen Street, the quiet fear that had settled over the neighborhood when the crime first happened. Now the mystery had a suspect, but questions still lingered. Inside the interrogation room at the Mesa Police Department, detectives placed a recorder on the table and sat across from the man who had once been just another neighbor in the background of a tragedy. He looked older than the photographs from 2000, his hair thinner, his posture heavier. But the DNA evidence on the table between them left little doubt. Detective Alvarez spoke first. She described the evidence calmly. The trace material found on the victim's clothing, the DNA profile extracted years later, the genealogy analysis that led investigators back to Evergreen Street. She described the discarded cup recovered from the restaurant trash can and the laboratory match that followed. Each detail closed the circle a little tighter. The suspect listened quietly. For a long time, he said nothing. Detectives had seen this silence before. Sometimes suspects spoke quickly once confronted with evidence. Other times they waited, hoping investigators were bluffing. But in cold cases, silence often carried a different weight. Years of buried memories pressing against the surface. Finally, he asked a single question. "How long have you known?" Alvarez leaned forward slightly. "Long enough." What happened next would later be described in court records as partial admissions, fragments of a story that investigators had waited decades to hear. The man didn't describe himself as a killer. Instead, he spoke about that night with the strange detachment of someone revisiting a distant memory. He said he had known the victim. They had spoken occasionally over the years. Casual conversations across the yard, polite exchanges between neighbors who lived only a few houses apart. Nothing unusual, nothing threatening. But on the night of the murder, something had changed. According to his account, an argument began after he entered the house unexpectedly. Detectives pressed him for details. Why had he gone inside? What had started the argument? His answers shifted, sometimes vague, sometimes contradictory. What remained consistent was the moment everything spiraled. He claimed the fight escalated suddenly. Voices raised. Tempers flared. Then violence. The room in which he spoke those words was silent except for the faint hum of the recorder. For detectives who had studied the crime scene photographs countless times, the confession fragments filled in pieces of a puzzle that had haunted investigators for 2 decades. But even as the suspect spoke, one thing remained painfully clear. The truth would never fully return. Time had eroded too much. Memories had faded. Evidence had aged. What investigators now possessed was enough to bring charges, enough to present in court, enough to give the case a legal conclusion. But the emotional center of the crime, the exact moment when anger turned into murder, remained buried somewhere in the past. When the interrogation ended, detectives walked out into the hallway carrying the weight of 20 years in a single folder. Outside the police station, reporters had already gathered. Cameras flashed. Microphones rose toward the officials stepping to the podium. The announcement was brief but powerful. After 2 decades, the Evergreen Street murder was no longer a mystery. A suspect had been arrested. For the victim's remaining family members, the moment arrived with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. They had lived with unanswered questions for most of their lives. Birthdays, holidays, anniversaries of the crime, each year marked by the absence of someone who never came home. Now the investigation had finally reached the person detectives believed responsible. But closure, as many families learn, rarely arrives as cleanly as people expect. Court proceedings began months later, and the details of the case unfolded publicly for the first time. Jurors saw the old photographs from 2000, the bedroom, the hallway, the evidence collected under bright forensic lights. They heard testimony from investigators who had worked the case in its earliest days and from the new detectives who had resurrected it nearly 20 years later. They heard about the DNA evidence. They heard about the genealogy research that pointed investigators toward Evergreen Street. They heard about the quiet neighbor who had once told police he knew nothing. The courtroom remained silent as the timeline stretched across 2 decades of waiting. And in that silence, the story revealed something unsettling about cold cases. Time does not erase them. It hides them. The streets change. The houses age. People move away or grow older. But the truth waits quietly beneath the surface, sometimes for years, sometimes for generations, until the smallest piece of evidence finally pulls it back into the light. In Mesa, the Evergreen Street case became a symbol of that reality. For some residents, the arrest brought relief. The mystery that had lingered over their neighborhood was finally explained. For others, it brought a different emotion entirely, the chilling realization that the person responsible had lived among them for decades, walking the same sidewalks, attending the same community events, passing them on quiet suburban streets. The quiet neighbor had never seemed dangerous. And yet the evidence told a very different story. Long after the trial concluded, Evergreen Street returned to its familiar calm. Children rode bicycles again. Porch lights glowed softly in the evenings. Cars passed slowly through the neighborhood, without knowing the history embedded in the asphalt. But for those who remembered the case, one truth remained impossible to forget. For 20 years, the answer had been there. Not in a distant city, not in a criminal database, but just a few houses away. And that is the haunting nature of cold cases. They are not always buried in darkness. Sometimes they live quietly next door, waiting for the day when time finally runs out.